Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jo Shaw. I'm the Dean of Research and Deputy Head of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's my pleasure this evening to welcome everybody from far and wide, as well as from near, to the inaugural lecture of Professor Richard Williams, who's taking up the chair of Contemporary Visual Cultures, and I don't think there's too much doubt about what he's going to be presenting on today. But just briefly, I'd like to welcome everybody here, particularly welcome members of Richard's family who've come here both from the city of Edinburgh but from further afield, and also welcome colleagues from the School of Arts, Cultures and Environment, in which Richard works, in the History of Art subject groups, but also colleagues obviously from the Edinburgh College of Art. And I think this lecture falls really quite conveniently the day after the Minister's letter was sent yesterday approving the merger between the College of Art and the University of Edinburgh. I'm delighted to see the Principal of the University of Edinburgh, Professor Sir Timothy O'Shea, who's joining us here this evening. So very briefly about Richard, although I could speak much more extensively about Richard, both because he has an extremely extensive and impressive CV and writes books with much more interesting titles than I could ever dream about as a humble lawyer, but also because I know Richard very well, because I think, as probably everybody in this room already knows, Richard is a fantastic citizen of both his school but also of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. He's the Dean of Postgraduate Studies, as well as being the active research convener in his own subject group, and being very involved, I think, in much of the work around the pre-work around the merger, which I already referred to. So how Richard finds any time to do research, and clearly he does from his impressive CV, is a mystery to me. But he does say in the notes that I was given that Richard doesn't have any spare time, but if he did, he would spend it climbing hills, cooking and eating. But I believe you walked up Ben Lomond last year, so you're lying. You clearly do.
Well, I did know once. That was once in 6 months. Yeah.
You're not working hard enough, Richard.
No, obviously no.
It's terrible. You succeeded in that. Richard has been educated in both a number of places and also in a number of ways, in a way that combines beautifully this broader vision of arts and the arts and art and design and history of art and architecture. His undergraduate studies were in the area of fine art, studio practice and art history at Goldsmiths College in London, and then he did his master's and his PhD in the history of art at the University of Manchester, and he's worked in a number of places before moving to Edinburgh in the year 2000, where he's risen pretty rapidly through the ranks, being a very successful researcher as well as a great contributor in so many other ways. And he received his chair earlier on this year in, as I said, Contemporary Visual Cultures. And Richard's current project, and I have to mention this, is the writing of a book called Sex and Buildings, A History of Sexuality and Modern Architecture, an 80,000-word book for Reaction Books, under contract publication in 2011. We can't wait, gentlemen. Richard, as I said, clearly has much to commend him. And our meetings, which are ostensibly about discussing the overlap between our job descriptions, which taxed us so much we had to get someone else in to deal with it, as an associate dean, usually degenerate into Richard describing his many different projects in different areas, including space travel and various other things which he does as sidelines, as well as his serious art history stuff. So here is someone clearly who not only speaks to the university's research agenda, who works as a good citizen within his school and within the college, but also deals with the knowledge transfer agenda and the knowledge exchange agenda, who reaches out in different ways with his expertise, his knowledge and his understanding. So I'm not going to read out the inaugural lecture's abstract. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm simply going to now stop and introduce Richard, who'll speak for
about 40 minutes.
And are you taking questions? We've got
if anyone's got any questions, can they submit them in writing? I won't do any.
I think we're inclining away from questions and in favour of drink at the end. So we'll do that, and I'll explain to everybody where that is. It'll be a short progress from here. Richard's going to speak on globalization's spectacular ruins then for about 40 minutes. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Joe, for that lovely and moving introduction. I don't really know what to say now, but I think there's a paper here somewhere. Let's just see. Is the sound okay at the back? Is that about right? Yeah? Big thumbs up there. I've just broken the roving mic, so I think we'll just have to stay with the fixed one, but I might want to, I might wander about and gesticulate a bit. At which point I'll just shout. Okay, but any problems, just let me know. This is a lecture which I haven't given before. It seemed that doing an inaugural lecture was an excuse or a license to do something a bit different. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. And it's a lot more anecdotal and indeed autobiographical than I would usually do. And if you halfway through find that rather self-indulgent, then just as you leave, just don't disturb the others. And don't mind if you make a start on the wine. That's just fine. But it is a bit of an experiment, so bear with me there. The other thing I'd say about it is that normally in a lecture I would just talk, and well, the scope for messing this up with such a grand occasion is considerable. So I've written it. So I'm going to have to read it. So bear with me if it sounds a little stilted in places and if I switch from one mode to another. But there we are. As Joe said, it's about 40 minutes altogether. Right. I'll begin with a story, as it were. The image in front of you is the junction of Portland Avenue and South Columbus Boulevard in Philadelphia, an industrial part of that eastern seaboard metropolis along the Delaware River in the United States. The foreground is legibly port architecture, bonded warehouses, containers stacked, scrubby wasteland. And in the background, behind the main warehouses, but still quite clear, is a huge, decayed-looking ship. Even half concealed, it's recognisably a mid-20th century Atlantic liner. Its length, its unusually high freeboard, its twin funnels, and its long white superstructure all identify the type. Its proportions recall those famous liners operated by the English shipping line Cunard, the Queen Mary, now berthed permanently in Long Beach, California, as a hotel and convention centre, or more recently, the Queen Elizabeth II, now on its way to Dubai for similar treatment. The ship is one that one or two of you may in fact know. In fact, those of you in history of art, I've subjected you to many conversations about this, so you will know it. It's the SS United States, commissioned in wartime, Second World War, by the US Navy as a troop ship, and designed by a remarkable autodidact naval architect, William Gibbs, coincidentally a native of Philadelphia. It was put into service not as a troop ship, but as a passenger liner in 1952 with United States Lines on the North Atlantic run between New York, Le Havre and Southampton. And it very quickly broke all existing speed records. Its fastest run across the Atlantic took a little over 3 days. This was in June 1952, at an average speed of 35 knots. The friction generated on the crossing stripped the paintwork at the bow down to the bare metal. There are some astonishing photographs of that. Its normal service speed was over 30 knots, although it was allegedly tested at speeds of up to 45 knots, which for those of you who are not nautically minded is about 50 miles an hour, a scarcely credible speed for an object that is about the size of the Palace of Westminster. Its career was nevertheless remarkably short. Actually, I should say that it broke a record. I mean, for those of you who know about these things, it held the blue riband record for crossing the Atlantic. And that record was not broken for another about 40 years, but not by a ship, but by a specially designed powerboat. So something, actually Richard Branson's project. But there's never been a vehicle of this size and this type that's been able to do what it did. Despite these remarkable characteristics, its career was nevertheless remarkably short, just 17 years. It was retired in 1969, a victim of the development of popular transatlantic air travel. And that it still exists at all is remarkable. And in fact, if you try to think about what other comparable objects like this there are very, very few indeed. I mean, they're very powerful in the popular imagination through Titanic or whatever. Try to think of a liner of this scale, this importance, that actually still exists apart from the Queen Mary. There isn't one apart from this. It's been bought and sold 4 times, each sale accompanied by the hope that it may be converted into a viable cruise ship or a floating hotel or a casino or a museum, or sometimes a combination of all of these things. It sailed the Atlantic once since retirement in the early 1990s, accompanied by a fleet of tugs on a trip to a ship repair yard in the former USSR to have its asbestos stripped out, along with all its interior fittings. The fact that it ended up in the former USSR is one of the many ironies about its history. These are 2 low-res but fascinating images of that trip. On the right-hand side, there it is, just leaving American waters on this trip. It was photographed on the voyage by 2 astonished American tourists. We're now looking at the left-hand image, on vacation in Istanbul, and they saw it tugged through the Bosphorus as ferries and fishing boats dodged round about. As passengers on the United States many years previously, the apparition, they said, was, quote, like seeing a ghost. And their expression of surprise mixed with fear is a marvellous expression of the uncanny, to invoke Freud's perhaps overused but still useful term. Here is a situation of relative normality, a tourist trip, some familiar monuments, some fun, made suddenly strange by the appearance of a sight from home, on one level desperately familiar, but on another level desperately strange, for not only was it in completely the wrong place, but it had returned as if it were from the dead. And I hope you can see, it's a very low-res image, but I hope you can see something of that. Imagine that situation. There's something desperately strange and weird about it, I think. Well, I can empathise with these tourists because the United States, this is the autobiographical part, the United States is part of my own story. I was myself one of its passengers in September 1967. There I am. I'm not the one with the beard, there's a hint. Aged 3 months. I was born in Washington, D.C., where my parents had been living, and they were bringing me back home. And they'd chosen, in what I interpreted as a romantic gesture, to make the voyage by sea. Maybe it was just cheaper. In any case, there can't have been much difference in price in those days. We'll find out the truth later on, I think, yes. I have no memories of the trip, of course. I slept a lot. I ate melon. There was apparently a glut of melons aboard. And I knew about this all much later when my parents told me about it. And there were lovely Kodachromes that we sometimes looked at too. There they are. None of the liner itself, to my continuing irritation, but some of us on deck, and of Manhattan, and of the Queen Mary berthed at Southampton, having that month been decommissioned, prefiguring the United States' retirement only 2 years later. So these are the 4 snaps that I managed to reconstruct. Rather nice to see them, actually. And on the a nice picture of Manhattan, my memory of this was that 2-funnelled liner there was in fact one of the sister ships of the United States, but it's which would have been the independence of the Constitution. It's not. It's much smaller than that, and I don't know exactly what it was. The tall building there is a rather remarkable blank facaded telephone exchange, a Bell telephone exchange, which is an almost completely blank facade. A building that had just been put up. It's about 1967. And then on the lower block, there's a nice photograph you can see of the ship, mid-Atlantic there. Nice bright sunshine. There were also things that had been collected during the voyage that I remembered. There was an annotated deck plan. I'll show that. Yeah, there it is. On the left-hand side, showing a cut-out drawing of the ship with all the important parts clearly identified, another pointing out the ship's main features. There were some luggage tags, you can see one there, and some postcards of such a peculiarly low resolution and strange hue that the liner appeared to dissolve into a pea-green Atlantic. The sulphurous corrosive quality of this colour seem, in retrospect, to prefigure its later sad condition. Well, there's some poetic license there, but they were very strange postcards. Unfortunately, I don't have them. Just something about this is rather nice. This is from the deck plan, which I scanned yesterday. And there's a rather sort of nice little commentary. It says the executive route. It says businessmen enjoy a quiet interlude from shore-based problems. More and more busy executives are enjoying an unhurried crossing of the Atlantic. This is 1964. Very sad statement there. I think more in hope than reality. But I mean, rather nice bunch of photographs. They're very nice, these things. So So for me, the United States is a powerful, albeit acquired memory, and from childhood it became a minor obsession. And I have to, well, it'll become quite clear this still is something of an obsession. I went straight to it in encyclopedias. I found a tiny picture of it, there it is, in Miroslav Sassek's illustrated book, This is New York. You may have these books. You know, This is Edinburgh. Yes, and you know, these wonderful illustrated children's books, and it appears there in an aerial view of Manhattan, just a few blobs of gouache, but unmistakable as the Empire State, which also figures. There you are, you can see it. New York is the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, and it is full of the biggest things. I looked vainly for signs of the United States in Le Havre once on holiday, the French port being one of its calling points. And as we caught the ferry to go back to England, we were in the building where it would have called. And I sort of wished, I tried to will it into being, but it never appeared. And I drew it often, learning from an early age how to reproduce in a schematic way its winged funnels, its superstructure, its clipper bow and cruiser stern. I made a model of it. I found a plastic kit of it in a Cheshire toy shop aged 11, and having explained to the proprietor that I'd once been a passenger on board, negotiated, to my immense surprise, an enormous discount. It cost £1. I was delighted with it. I don't have it anymore. I didn't think about the United States for quite a few years, until 1992, when I saw a professional model of it. You know, those models that you sometimes used to see of ships or aeroplanes in travel agents. In a travel agent in Vigo, the gloomy Galician port where I was working for a few days. This was another life when I was a sort of travelling salesman for a while, and I would do that sort of thing. Alongside Le Havre in Southampton, Vigo was one of the United States' European stopping points. Vigo still had its Atlantic terminal, and the ship appeared in the window of the travel agent, proudly advertising the United States lines, as if 23 years after the ship's retirement, it was still possible to buy a ticket. A more mournful sight, this desolate office facing the enormous desolation of the terminal in the rain. It's hard to imagine. No ship had called in 20 years, yet the office somehow remained open. Galicia is like that, if you've been there. And strangest of all, I thought I saw the United States once before, also in 1992, when I was crossing the Girard Point Bridge on Interstate 95, just west of Philadelphia. I was sure I glimpsed it through the girders, its winged funnel silhouetted in the late afternoon. But the sun was in my eyes, and whatever I saw, I only saw for a fraction of a second. And more to the point, I was doing 70 in the outside lane. There wasn't time to look at it again. As it happens, it couldn't have been the United States, as I later found out, because at that time it was somewhere in the former USSR, having its asbestos removed and its interiors. That, of course, I now know from the web, and it's the numberless sites devoted to the ship that told me a few years later that the thing still existed. Well, anyway, I could go on, but I won't. There's another paper to be written about all that, maybe a novel, or maybe just a session with a good shrink. What I want to do here, or now, is pull away from anecdote and try to say something about the specificity of its situation, and then how that situation relates to a set of wider images of shipping in the visual arts, and then some remarks about globalization. In Philadelphia, the United States can be found here at Pier 82 on South Columbus Boulevard. It's a couple of miles south of the central city. I hope you can you see it clearly enough there? This is it's a Google Maps image. You can actually fly around it on Google Earth, although it becomes extremely, sort of rather depressingly schematic, but it's very strongly present there in this satellite image. So there it is, that's Pier 82. Columbus Boulevard, I-95, the big interstate on the far left-hand side of the image. And at that point, the city sort of devolves into this very low-rise, late 19th century landscape, very similar to northern English industrial cities. So lots of what we would call terraced housing, what is called row housing there, and in a rather sad condition, it must be said. So it's at Pier 82 on South Columbus Boulevard. It's clearly visible from the interstate, I-95. It's huge smokestacks dominating the immediate landscape. There is nothing taller than this. And that landscape is in some ways an archetype in those parts of the world that first industrialized and have later lost their role. Philadelphia, it's worth saying, was one of the world's 10 largest cities in 1900. It's a sprawling mass of underutilised docks, once thick with ships, now become ad hoc storage, scrapyards and car parking. And everything on the port side has an enervated feel. The buildings, such as they are just shacks or semi-ruins. Containers are the defining feature, but this is not the automated landscape of Rotterdam or Singapore, but something much quieter and much sadder. And this is where the United States arrived in 1996 from the USSR, and where it's been ever since. The port side of Columbus Boulevard is a wreck. The other side, it has to be said, isn't. Here is some reasonably successful regeneration. There's a bunch of big retail outlets, fast food restaurants, and at least one enormous lap dancing club. I didn't go there. The store immediately opposite Pier 82 is familiar to all of you. It's IKEA, or IKEA, the ubiquitous Swedish furniture store, the saviour and curse of middle-class life everywhere in the industrialised world. And the relationship between the two, the ship and the store, not the ship and the shore, but the ship and the store, is extremely striking. This is a photograph of Columbus Boulevard. Let's just see what else we have. There's a... I was having fun taking pictures. Right, IKEA. There's a reflection of the SS United States in the ground floor window of the store and a shopping trolley. 2 points are worth making here. IKEA first arrived on Columbus Boulevard in 2005, no doubt in the expectation that the United States was only a temporary presence. But the United States has been there 15 years, far longer than the store, and almost as long as those stores are designed to last in the first place. It's become inadvertently permanent and one of the sights of the city. Its strange permanence is one thing. The other, perhaps more important thing, is the way that IKEA has unusually recognised its surroundings. IKEA, as we all know, functions by incarcerating its customers, trapping them in a windowless maze from which they are so desperate to escape that they will buy anything. There are routinely only 2 windows for customers. I mean, you may know that all IKEA stores are basically the same. They contract out it's like a franchise design, which is then built by local architects. Routinely, there are only 2 windows for customers. One halfway around, a small one that looks out onto some familiar feature, locality, as it were, reduced to a sort of postmodern quotation. In Edinburgh, the Edinburgh one, you'll know it's Kirketten Hill, at the end of the Pentlands. The other window that there's routinely there is a long ribbon window at first floor level, providing light into the cafe. And the view from here is rarely anything more dramatic than acres of car parking. Well, at Philadelphia, you get this. You eat your meatballs with lingonberry jam, looking out onto this astonishing view. The window is completely, amazingly filled by this liner. I mean, it doesn't quite do justice to it. One of the things that you notice there is when you pull back from this window, and you're kind of in the middle of the store, as it were, with about 100 metres to the window. The ship completely fills the view. It blocks it out. When you get closer to the window, strangely, it doesn't quite do that. But still, this is... Imagine if you were in the Edinburgh one, the Sainsbury's that you can see from the Edinburgh one would probably go up about to that gantry. So this is much, much bigger than normally what you can see out of the window. It's a simple point, but that's what we do as art historians. Anyway, the incongruity of this view is simply breathtaking. It's not just the size of the thing, but the fact that it's a completely unmediated presence from another time. Unpainted since 1969, it's never been presented to the public, it's never been interpreted, to use a fashionable word in museum education these days, or it has never been in any other way brought respectably into the realm of heritage. It's a presence from another time entirely. I mean, just think how many other objects can you think of that had not been painted or somehow looked after for that long? There aren't that many. IKEA, it should be said, helps. Its gridded windows act as an inadvertent screen, framing and in fact representing the view as if it were a movie. They're the same proportions exactly as a movie screen or a car windscreen. It would be inconceivable to ignore this enormous ghostly presence, the elephant in the room, as it were. So IKEA, in a departure from its usual practice, actively acknowledges the presence of the ship and therefore the locality, identifying it and referring the interested observer to a website. Good for them. So that's the little sign that they put up in the cafe. It says, "Ever wondered about the big ship across the street?" No. And it tells you what to do. And then it gives you the website is the United States Conservancy Organization, which is basically coordinating the rescue effort. So the situation is rich with ironies. The ship's been there longer than the store. It might even outlive it. Both represent a kind of globalization, but the Swedish import, not the American, the American native, as it were, has somehow won. The ship disrupts the smooth surface of the retail landscape. Yet the ship is also representative of processes of globalization. It represents the displacement of, let's say, masculine labor by feminine consumption. You could make an argument about that. It's become a tourist attraction in its own right, despite being never set up in that way formally. Every day for years, people have come to photograph it, much to the irritation of the stevedores, whose job it is to keep people away. They really are, they've had enough, the people who work in the docks. They just want it scrapped. IKEA is in some ways the artist here. Don't send that statement to private eye. But IKEA has a sort of agency here that you wouldn't expect. Its framing of the site, of course, brings the situation into line with the tradition of making images of ships in which the ship is represented in an urban context. The shorthand, you might say, being that the ship at the end of the street. And one of the things that we could do with this, to push it further, would be to make a list of images of ships in an urban context and to say something about those. And I'll just give you an idea of how you might do that. The surreal potential of images like this is well known, and it goes back a long way. Here is a very well known but anonymous photograph of Belfast's Harland and Wolff shipyard in 1911. The two ships under construction here, the Olympic and the Titanic, quite a well known image. There's also, I should say, autobiographically a family connection here, and allegedly I have a great grandfather who was involved in or worked in the shipyard here, but then I think everybody in Belfast had a great grandfather who worked on the Titanic somehow. Its appearance in photography invariably signals something strange. Ships are familiar, especially the great liners, but they show up in odd places. They disrupt and distort their settings. The arrival of a ship might suddenly double a small port's population. Its departure empties it again. The capacity to disrupt or disturb through simple presence is a major theme in documentary photography of ships, and it's analogous in effect to the effects that are sought by the surreal, as it were, in art, if we were to investigate that. Here are sublimely large objects in the wrong place. And the same visual rhetoric motivates photographs like this. This is E. Chambray-Hardman's equally well-known image of Birkenhead in 1946. Chambray-Hardman was a Liverpool photographer and specialised in urban images. This, I think, to produce this, I'm sure it's slightly exaggerated in that he burnt out the ship a little bit to exaggerate its shininess. This is an image of Birkenhead, as I say, where the British Navy's new aircraft carrier, the Ark Royal, was gleaming surreally against dense rows of brick cottages, utterly incongruous and incomprehensible, yet simultaneously the reason for the entire existence of the town. The uncanny ship is an important cinematic trope too. Two examples just sprung to mind. Think here of Hitchcock's extraordinarily nasty film Marnie, and the scene in which the female protagonist returns with Sean Connery to the working class terraces of her childhood Baltimore. And in this scene, huge freighters rise surreally at the end of the street, and the strange effect is heightened by Hitchcock's anachronistic use of the painted backdrop, the matte. What was already uncanny, what was already strange, is made even more so by the matte's lurid colours and weird perspective. And Hitchcock, as is well known, but he persisted with these rather anachronistic cinematic techniques for much longer than others did, but he liked the weirdness of these effects. He was also very keen on this kind of imagery. More recently, quite a different film, but an interesting one. The widely distributed Turkish film Uzak, or Distant, directed by Nuri Bilge Ceylan, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, 2002. It repeatedly deploys the trope of the ship in the urban landscape. In a freezing Istanbul, already rendered unfamiliar by snow, supertankers suddenly close off street views as they slink down the Bosphorus on their way to the Med. And in one iconic scene, a lone male, well, the protagonist in fact, is seen walking along a snowy path against an indeterminate but clearly man-made structure. The camera pans out and the background is revealed as a cargo ship listing crazily and half sunk. We're looking at the ludicrously angled deck. It's one of the most arresting images I've seen in contemporary cinema. And no doubt you can think of your own examples too. Now, in all of these images, all right, the ship represents what we might call the uncanny. It's a term much used in art history. Freud, it's funny, I do this class on psychoanalysis from time to time, and I always, my starting point now is really nowhere else in the university would we talk sensibly about Freud, and yet in the humanities, and nowhere more so than in art history, Freud has this very powerful presence. What I say now is that he was a dubious physician but a great art historian. I think he should have, and he was. Anyway, specifically, when we refer to the uncanny, the ship is a disturbing presence, especially when it's juxtaposed with the city. It's an object on the same scale as the city, but it comes and goes, it's unfixed, it's foreign. In seconds, it turns the familiar upside down. I'm sure you're used to this idea now. And there's more to say about that if we wanted to, but I want to move on to say something about the globalization that I mentioned in the title. And this is such an overused word, but it started to motivate several discussions that I've been involved with. So I do want to say something about it. And what we're looking at here is an image by a Canadian photographer, Edward Bertinsky, one of a whole series of similar images. So about globalization, ships arguably represent better than anything else how capital actually works. They show up the instability of capital, its capacity to destroy as much as its capacity to create, and its inevitable production of ruins as a byproduct of its main processes. Ships also say something about the furtive quality of capital too. I've consciously avoided theory in this talk, but Walter Benjamin's image of progress is salient here. And he has this metaphorical figure of the angel of history, which he describes in 1940. He's trying to describe progress. And he says, "A storm is blowing in from paradise. It's got caught in the angel's wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress." Nice image there, but much quoted. Well, that upward growing pile of debris is well represented here in Edward Bertinsky's remarkable and now well-known series of photographs of Chittagong, Bangladesh, where the main industry is shipbreaking. It's interesting to think about shipbreaking here in this context, because we just north of here, the Firth of Forth was really the centre of the European shipbreaking industry for a long time. Here in Chittagong, thousands of barefoot labourers armed with the oxyacetylene cutters take apart the largest ships in the world. There's a gently sloping beach on which you can ram vessels at full speed. There's an inexhaustible supply of cheap labour, and there is a more or less complete indifference and disregard to safety. An immensely dangerous business. It kills hundreds each year. Art, cruel and indifferent to suffering, of course, loves Chittagong. Here is the contemporary sublime, safely offshored. Well, that's interesting in itself, but it also shows the end point of a global process that's otherwise rather invisible. We depend on ships more than ever, but since we ourselves rarely travel that way these days, the business of shipping remains furtive and somewhat hidden. Those huge bulk carriers and tankers that snake up and down the Firth of Forth don't stay long. Their multinational crews rarely come ashore. The vessels themselves are registered under flags of a litany of failed states. It's a remarkably furtive business, given its centrality to everything we do. Much of our oil and gas comes that way. Almost all of our manufactured goods. Cheap shipping made China's boom possible. But we rarely see it, except when something goes wrong. Do any of you see this? Yeah. In 2008, something did. One quick result of the global economic slump was a sudden, representative, proportionate slump in shipping. For the residents of Loch Striven on the north side of the Clyde estuary, this had dramatic consequences. For overnight, there appeared in the middle of the narrow loch 6 of the largest container ships in the world, moored together stern to bow as a raft. Their enormity and frank ugliness caused an immediate controversy. Not surprising if it was in your back garden too. The waters of the loch, unlike the surrounding land, were not subject to any planning controls, and those responsible for the laying up of the vessels, the Manchester-based Peel Ports, a private company, were evasive. On top of it all, the ships were bright blue and visible miles away. I saw them from 10 miles away, couldn't work out what they were for a long time. They belonged to the Danish multinational Maersk, and they wound up in the loch because with the slump they suddenly represented surplus capacity. No one knew how long they would stay. But as in the case of the United States, they became an inadvertent tourist site, so much so that they attracted the attention of the producers of Mission 2110, a sci-fi series for children's BBC, and they used the raft as a set. During its making, over several months, a film crew of 60 was based on board. The series premiered in April 2010 while the ships were still moored, and the raft was gradually reduced in size as the global economy picked up. And it was, according to Lloyd's list, which I consulted the other day, eventually dismantled by July. Its component vessels went to Hamburg then for re-engining, making them fuel efficient, because in one of those strange paradoxes around where the globalization works, slower. Well, the Maersk story is a clear representation in material form of the profligate workings of global capital. Gosh, there's a sentence for you. So differently is the story of the United States. The liner's initial displacement from service is about the displacement of one technology by another as the economics change. Its multiple changes of ownership have seen it shift from the United States government in the 1960s to a joint US-Malaysian company via interests in Turkey, the former USSR and Norway, and no doubt others. Its location, the Philadelphia docks, is one of those places that have been most damaged by globalization in recent years. It's an evacuated, empty zone fringed by miles of decayed inner-city housing. And the case of the United States also shows how exclusionary the workings of capital can be, how literally forbidding. The United States may have become an attraction in some ways, but there's literally no safe public place from which it can be viewed. Almost any viewpoint involves some sort of transgression. And by that I mean, there are good views from IKEA, but that's a private place, and there's a limit to how long you can stay in the cafe. This does not exist in the public realm. And as soon as you get outside of the public realm, you're faced with signs like this. It's the most unfriendly environment imaginable. Bear with me, I've got a short section here on method, and then there's a conclusion. What I've been doing here, in short, is to show the workings of the global economy through the observation of the built environment. And that's been a theme in most of the things that I've done here in Edinburgh. And it's increasingly taken me away from what might be described as conventional art historical territory. And in that, I should say, the methods of art history, the close attention to images, remains extremely important for me. But it's perhaps the subject matter or the things I look at are perhaps different. And I realised long ago that I was spending more time, firstly, on Seafield Road, doing various, just buying bits of furniture and going to garages, far more time there than the National Galleries, and then later at IKEA. And further, or worse, depending on your point of view, I was finding the experience of IKEA more interesting. Don't tell anyone at the National Galleries. Almost everything you need to know about a contemporary industrialised global economy you can find out at IKEA: its economies of scale, the location of its manufacturing, its devolution of distribution and assembly. What I mean by that is you have to take the stuff home and make it. The geographical location of its stores, the peculiarly maddening psychological effect it has on its customers. But IKEA is also fascinating visually. All of that democratised modernism, unbelievably cheap, and done, I think, for the price, unbelievably well. Now we can all have pastiches of Mies or Le Corbusier furniture in our living rooms. I've routinely taken students there too, instructing them not, at least at first, not to buy anything, but just to look, treating the experience as they would a museum. And the result has sometimes been awkward, sometimes funny, always worthwhile. We've had some fantastic work out of those visits, unlikely as it may seem. IKEA represents one kind of site I routinely visit in the name of so-called work. It's contemporary, visually rich, but geographically peripheral. And in general, I'm interested in places where the global economy appears to be at work, not the finished sites, but the places under development, the economic equivalent of the festering swamps and bogs the Gaia theorist James Lovelock thinks are so important in regulating the global environment. Columbus Boulevard in Philadelphia is one of those. The square mile around the United States tells you everything you need to know about something else, about the condition of a decaying eastern seaboard American metropolis, from its patterns of labour to its tastes in food and home furnishings, the way it moves around, even its sexual habits. Now, my choice of site is underpinned by a certain amount of economic theory, Marxist and post-Marxist, I suppose. And I share a rather utilitarian view of art as a result. And I should say, I'm going to say some slightly disparaging things about art, but I'm a practitioner as well, so I feel justified in doing that. I'm not sure that art is defensible as a special commodity with inalienable rights to its existence. In our present circumstances, it's a luxury commodity like any other, more or less interesting, depending. It's also invariably conditioned by the circumstances of its production. It can only exist if there's a demand for it, even at the most individual level. It can only be made if there are the right materials. The individual artist is a nice myth, but better to think of him or her as a strange kind of craft maker and a function of networks of production and exchange. I mean, that sounds a bit gloomy maybe, but I believe it. The big photographs I make from time to time couldn't be done without a bit of spare cash, access to cheap technology and software, and some marvellous technicians around the university. I've become more interested as a result in cultural phenomena that are more overtly collective, phenomena that involve open and complex relations of production, exchange and consumption. I'm more interested in situations than individual objects. I also think, hope this talk has made clear, that these situations are often temporary and multiform. They're limited by time and they involve different forms of materialization, from buildings to photographs to vehicles of one kind or another to news reports to snippets of conversation. My Philadelphia experience is a good example. It's a ship, it's a site, it's a story with a discursive as well as material existence. The story also represents for me an approach to visual arts research in which the traditional boundaries between theory and practice have become ambiguous. That sounds like empty rhetoric. It's not. I take far more photographs now than I ever did as an art student in the 1980s. There are now hundreds of them out. Sorry, there's no false modesty here. I mean, it's simply it's so easy to do it. There are hundreds of them out there in the public domain, in books, articles, and on the web. Particularly on the web, it's so easy to distribute your stuff now. How I use them is really indistinguishable from the way that architects do it at a certain stage of their project work. Certainly anybody concerned with the urban environment. It's pretty much what our MSc in the City students do. And it's not far at all from the obsessive accumulation of data or visual data that you find in the work of a kind of latter-day conceptual artist like Alan Sekula, whose work also has dealt with globalization and its consequences. I still write books, I'm still attached to the book form, but I do wonder sometimes for how much longer. And in saying that, I'm not saying I'm any good at image making or I want to be an artist, but that the technology now makes possible what used to be concentrated in the hands of a few professionals. In our subject group in ACE, we've seen huge changes in that area. That democratization of image making is fantastic. It makes us all potential artists, something I think we should celebrate and exploit. Who here isn't carrying a camera? Who hasn't made a video? Who hasn't put a picture up on the web? Don't put your hands up, please. Right, okay, back to just a little bit more. There we are. Back to the United States for the last time. What's happened to it? What of it now? Its present situation is as precarious as ever, unfortunately. Its technical owners, the giant cruise line NCL, stepped up in 2006, promising a properly restored American-flagged vessel for the perfect post-9/11 cruise market. This was called Project America. It's rather interesting. They went around buying up, or trying to buy up, historic vessels, and they were imagining that there would be a domestic cruise market for people to sail up and down the east and west coast, but also to sail through the Panama Canal. NCL's plans came unstuck with the global financial crisis of 2008, and a one-way trip to Chittagong seemed certain for the United States. That is, before the intervention of a Philadelphia philanthropist and also son of a naval architect, Jerry Lenfest, who donated $30 million to the United States Conservancy in 2010, buying time to develop a commercial future. They have to produce a plan by the end of this month, so it's quite interesting, the situation. And they came up with this plan. This is the latest architectural scheme to do something with it, which is no longer a scheme to refurbish it as a ship, but to make it into an urban attraction. This is by Stephen Varenhorst Architects, commercial practice on the East Coast, and it consists of a refurbished United States kitted out as a hotel at the heart of a casino complex quite close to its current location. And what you can see there is a kind of a dock. It's a complex rather like the berth of the Queen Mary in Long Beach, if you've seen that. So a kind of spectacular entertainment complex built around a static ship attraction. Those are. I have to say, I mean, when you see images like this, you realise they probably just put this together in about 5 minutes. There is quite a nice model there, which gives a bit more detail, but not a whole lot. What's this scheme about? Well, it's an attempt to insert the United States back into the global economy, if we were to think about it in grand terms. The liner, a vehicle of globalization, it was also a victim of that process. To take its place in the economy again, it has to take on a new form. It can't be a ship. There isn't, as NCL proved, a way of making a 50-year-old liner into a viable vehicle anymore. Even they admitted it would take about 6 years. But you can make it into a building, a spectacular building, which is precisely what the present scheme proposes to do. The casino would make it more like IKEA, of course, whose windows it currently fills, than the ship it really is. And if the scheme comes off, if it preserves the United States, it does it at some cost. As the French architect Bernard Tschumi remarked in relation to the rotting remains of Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie in the 1970s, then rotting, should be said, there's something viscerally exciting, even erotic, that's the word that he uses, about ruins. Ruins are alive. Sometimes they're literally moving before your eyes. And so it is with the United States. You see it like something in its death throes, never more alive than when it's approaching its end. Its evident decay and the ever-present threat of its demise powerfully motivate visitors. These things also generate an unprecedented conversation about it. There's an astonishingly rich and varied public discourse around it, far more, I suspect, now than in its time as a working ship. There are endless newspaper stories. It's a routine topic in the Philadelphia Inquirer. There are TV specials, there's TV documentaries, films, blogs, websites, photographs, artistic installations, artistic interventions, flash mobs, Sonne Lumiere charity events, as well as a steady stream of urban tourists like me with their cameras. All of these people, all of these activities are strongly conditioned by the condition of ruin, as it were. And the very presence of the United States serves to remind us what an uneven, wasteful, profligate process globalization is, even if we all ultimately benefit from it. It's a sort of industrial memento mori, as it were. Last slide. So what would I do? Well, the Varenhorst project was looking doubtful at the time of writing. Foxwoods, the proposed casino operator, has been indifferent throughout. It's quite a funny story. This scheme was proposed assuming that this casino business would get involved. The casino people have just never been remotely interested. And in December last year, Foxwoods, the casino people, they had their gaming license revoked for financial irregularities. It's not a good start. But if the scheme does come off, and if it does, it'll probably be in New York rather than Philadelphia. I think I'll be one of the first at the cocktail bar. I'd rather the United States exists, even in this sterilised, deracinated form. But that said, as an intellectual project, the United States, for me, better represents an object to think with. It represents, in other words, the way a material object can show up the complexities and contradictions of a process. I did that work rather by chance in Philadelphia, but there's no reason why you couldn't do something here, and I hope some of you do. So off you go now, down to the docks. Thanks.
That was entertaining, stimulating, and arresting in many ways, in equal measure. Thank you very much for the lecture. I think it told us very much about what your chair in contemporary visual culture really means to you, it really means to those that you work with and those who you share various aspects of your life with. I'm not sure whether they'll be going along with you to the cocktail bar, but I guess they'll now be possibly laying in a claim. I realised I had a little bit of credibility with Richard the other day when I showed him a picture of a big ship in one of these docks on my camera. I conformed to the stereotype of always having a camera, taking pictures and putting them on the web. What I thought was wonderful about your lecture was the way that you brought all these bits of tissues of our lives together and of our experience of the world in which we live, mainly urban environment, obviously here, but one could extend to the rural environment as well, and certainly did with the ships in Loch Striven, which is also the name of a Calmac ship, isn't it? So the way in which they interface with that's rural or semi-rural environment. It just remains for me to invite all of those present to join us for a brief libation in the conference room of the David Hume Tower. And that means to come out of this building back through the main entrance opposite the Informatics Forum, turn left into George Square, and follow the crowds of people that will doubtless be heading in that direction down to the base of another rather ugly one of the university's more ugly buildings, I'm afraid to say. Although it's not, unlike this one, it's also not quite so reconstructed inside. But that's the David Hume Tower, and you'll go in and turn left. And perhaps there'll be a servitor there. If
There's a sign.
There's a sign.
Yeah.
Richard has put signs.
Well, I know they do.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Good. That's excellent. You have to do everything these days for yourself.
You do.
So, Richard, thank you very much. Let's congratulate Richard once more.
This production is copyright The University of Edinburgh.